Hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us today. We are so excited to be here. In fact, this is how we feel. As educators, as parents who've benefited from the love and support of early learning educators, we know who you are and we value you, we respect you, and we love you.
And before we get into who we are and why we're here today, we want to take you back to the moment where you first met this guy. This is Fred Rogers, the iconic television host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which, if you don't know, was a children's television program that aired from 1968 to 2001. And if you're not familiar with Fred, if you're not familiar with the neighborhood, that's totally okay. We'll come back to that in a moment. But for those of you who grew up watching Mr. Rogers, we want you to take just a moment to think about what that experience was like. Maybe you watched Fred with a parent, or with a grandparent, or with a neighbor. Maybe you watched Fred by yourself, or with a sibling after school. Wherever you were, whoever you were with, take just a moment to jot down one word or one phrase that comes to mind when you picture Mr. Rogers. If you're anything like the thousands of teachers we've had the privilege to meet, then you probably wrote down a word or a phrase about how Fred Rogers made you feel. Accepted, special, safe. Maybe some of you wrote down Fred's favorite number, 143, which was his code for I love you, because there's one letter in I, 4 letters in love, and 3 letters in you. Fred and his television program made millions of kids feel loved.
And we're 2 of those kids. I'm Greg Baer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Grable Foundation and co-chair of a network called Remake Learning. It's a network that connects hundreds of schools, libraries, museums, and early learning centers just like yours.
And I'm Ryan Rydzeski. I'm a science and education reporter. I'm also a former teacher. All you really need to know about the 2 of us for right now is that we are children of Western Pennsylvania. So just like Mr. Rogers himself, we were born here. We moved to different parts of the country for a while, and eventually we found our respective ways home. So of course, Fred was a national celebrity, but here in Pittsburgh, Fred felt like he was ours because he really was our neighbor. And we had, and we still have, this deep emotional connection to Fred that we know lots of you probably share.
And not long ago, after years and years of research and lots of drafts, we published When You Wonder You're Learning. It's our book about how Fred Rogers did what he did and how Fred created those feelings in so many of us. Those feelings that we still have today. How Fred made each of us feel accepted and warm and special and safe. And how each of us can do the same for the kids in our care. You see, Fred had a method for doing all that. A method that all of us can continue to learn from. We call it the Fred method. Think of it like a simple equation, whole child, and all that we know we need to do to grow the academic, social, and emotional growth of every single child. Coupled with the learning sciences, everything that we're learning about learning itself. Whole child plus learning sciences equals the Fred method.
Today, all of us can learn from the Fred method. And together, we can work to apply it in our classrooms, on our school buses, in our cafeterias, in our early learning centers, and beyond, each in our own way. We can create the same caring atmosphere that we felt in the neighborhood. We can ensure the kids feel safe enough to be themselves and to work together. We can show them the power of wonder in everyone. And like Fred himself, we can use that power to show kids that together, we have the strength to solve hard problems. We can find the courage to love our neighbors. We can become creative, curious, caring human beings who can make life better for ourselves, our communities, and our planet. That's the power of wonder in everyone. That's the power of we. So how might we unleash that power with help from Mr. Rogers? Well, we're going to get into that, but first, a little background.
Fred was born in 1928 in Latrobe, a small town just east of Pittsburgh. We're not going to go too deeply into his background. Some of you may have read the biography or watched Morgan Neville's amazing documentary. But there are a couple things you should know about Fred if you want to understand the neighborhood and why it matters so much today. The first is that Fred hated television when he first encountered it. The first thing he ever saw, he said, was people throwing pies in each other's faces. and he hated to see people demeaning each other like that. But at the same time, he saw the technology's potential, and he decided, as he enrolled at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, that he wanted to use television to minister to children. And his teachers at the seminary said, well, if you're going to do that, you better study child development too. And that's how he ended up at Arsenal Children's Center in Pittsburgh. It was at Arsenal that some of the most brilliant psychologists and pediatricians and psychiatrists in the world happened to be working at the same time. There were folks like Benjamin Spock, the doctor whose book Baby and Childcare remains one of the best-selling books of all time, second only to the Bible. There was Erik Erikson, a world-renowned psychologist. And most importantly, there was Margaret McFarland, a psychiatry professor who became Fred's lifelong mentor and dear friend. So studying at Arsenal with these folks put Fred at the cutting edge of child development science. He took what he learned there and he blended it with original songs, stories, and puppetry, building what eventually became Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Every aspect of the program, from Fred's words to his wardrobe to the physical set itself, was grounded in science. It's an overlooked part of his legacy, but Fred was more than a nice guy in a sweater. He's what today we'd call a learning scientist. And in so many ways, he was a learning scientist who was decades ahead of his time.
That's right. Today we know more than we ever have about how humans learn. As a field, the science of learning includes everything from behavioral science to artificial intelligence, neuroscience, economics, and more. There are people in organizations and teachers just like you, doing amazing work to figure out the methods and the conditions that are most conducive to learning. And what's really fascinating about this stuff is the degree to which it validates, the degree to which it even mirrors what Fred Rogers was doing a half-century ago in Pittsburgh. One of the most amazing examples of this comes from a company you're all familiar with. It's called the Google. A few years back, Google was trying to figure out what makes a good boss. For a long time, they'd assumed that the best programmers automatically made the best managers, that the people who knew the most stuff ought to be the ones in charge. But Google being Google, they decided to test this assumption with something that they called Project Oxygen. And Project Oxygen analyzed tens of thousands of data points, things like performance reviews, employee surveys, exit interviews, and more. And what they found was that technical expertise, the ability to, write computer code in your sleep, that was important. In other words, content matters. There's no way around it. But among the things that mattered most, content ranked almost last. The other more important skills were things like building good relationships, things like caring about your fellow employees and their well-being. The people who succeeded at Google had all these qualities that Fred Rogers taught so well, these very human qualities that can't be replaced by machines. These are what Fred called his tools for learning. He said, I would rather give children the tools for learning. If we give them the tools, they'll want to learn the facts, and more importantly, they'll use the facts to build and not destroy. Fred knew that academic learning has to be paired with a nurturing of what's best in us, that one without the other is insufficient. He knew, just as you all know, that you need both in order to raise complete human beings. And here again, learning science is proving Fred right.
In fact, Fred's tools might be more important now than they were back then. Scientists, parents, employers, just about everyone else now say that Fred's tools are essential to children's success, especially in this age defined by algorithms and increasingly smart machines. And when we help kids to develop these qualities, not only are we giving them the tools to succeed someday as grown-ups, we're also giving them the tools to discover themselves, to discover what intrigues them, what bothers them, what moves them, and what brings them joy. Fred's tools have been shown to boost academic outcomes, mental well-being, and even physical health. They're up to 10 times more predictive of children's long-term success than test scores. They cost almost nothing to develop, and they hinge on the very things that make life worth living: self-acceptance, close, loving relationships, and a deep regard for our neighbors. You see, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was more than a children's television program. It's a proven blueprint for all of us in the early learning field.
So again, how might we apply the Fred method together to create early learning environments that unleash the power of wonder in everyone? Specifically, how might we use the Fred method for our first goal of the day, creating psychologically safe environments in which children learn best?
Let's start with a question. What's the best, most satisfying team of which you've ever been part? What made it so great? Take a moment to think about that. Do you have some team in mind? Maybe it was a team of colleagues. Maybe it was your sixth grade soccer team. Maybe it was the band you formed in high school. Whatever it was, we're going to pause here so you can take the next minute and talk about it with the people around you. Tell them for the next 60 seconds about the best team you've ever been part of.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for doing that. And as we try to figure out what all these teams had in common, we want to take you back to Google for just a minute. Not because Google is a perfect company by any means, but because it's emblematic, as Greg just told you, of the kinds of skills and mindsets that today's kids need in order to thrive in the world. So about a decade ago, executives there discovered a really interesting problem. Some of their teams were flourishing. They were going above and beyond. They were hitting their goals. Other teams, crashing and burning, failing to meet even the bare minimum when it came to their objectives. There was no obvious rhyme or reason as to why this was happening, right? Some of the teams were good friends outside of work, but some of the other good teams were full of people who didn't really know each other or didn't even particularly like one another. Strangest of all, some of the great teams and some of the bad teams were made up of the same people. These teams seemed to function really well in some settings and not so well in others. And so the company dug into 50 years worth of leadership science, analyzing hundreds of their own teams, trying to figure out what the underlying differences were. And eventually, they stumbled across the key: psychological safety. This is a concept first coined in the late 90s by a Harvard researcher named Amy Edmondson. Psychological safety, she says, is a sense of confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish someone for speaking up. The basic idea is that when people know that they face potential for threat or embarrassment or punishment, they tend to act in ways that stop the team from performing. They won't speak up when they feel that something's wrong, or they'll act out to divert attention from the fact that they don't know something. And you all know, teachers know better than anyone, this can be disastrous. In fact, in schools where kids feel that they'll be made fun of by their peers or their teachers for not knowing something, kids in those scores score on average 23 points lower on standardized tests. At Google, teams that lacked psychological safety missed their sales goals by an average of 19%. But on teams where members felt safe, where they felt they could speak up without being laughed at, where they felt they could voice dissent and even doubt, those teams exceeded their goals by almost the same amount. And they were more likely to get promoted. They were less likely to leave the company. They were just generally better able to capitalize on creative ideas. Fred himself talked about this. What happens if children hear that their mud pies are no good, or that their block buildings have no importance. So how did he create psychologically safe learning spaces in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood? Well, he started with what you all do every day. A lot of it came from predictable, purposeful routines. Think about how the neighborhood was structured. Every day, Fred pushed through that famous front door the exact same way. He would wave to us, he would sing the same song, he would take off his suit coat and put on a sweater, he would put on comfortable shoes, and we would sit down and Fred would tell us what we were going to do that day. We'd go off to the neighborhood of make-believe. We'd come back and Fred would talk about what we saw, and then we would end on the same song as usual. We always followed the same format. And when we deviated from that format, Fred would tell us what was going to happen. He would explain why the change was coming. In fact, you all see here that the walls are blue. Most people remember Fred's living room looking like this. What most people don't know is that the walls weren't always blue. In fact, in the beginning of the television program, they were beige. Fred dedicated an entire episode to changing the wall color. We saw him painting that. We heard him talking about why he wanted to change the colors. We knew when things were going to change. We saw it happen and we were ready for it. And while researching our book, one of the people we talked to was Hedda Sharapin. Now, Hedda is a master educator in her own right. She's sort of a legend when it comes to early learning. She was also a producer, though, in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. She worked with Fred from the very first day of production back in the late 1960s. And this is what she told us. We're not going to surprise you. We're going to tell you where you're going, and we're going to give you an introduction to it, and we're going to take you there. When we come back, we're going to talk about where we've been. You had a sense that the world was trustworthy and predictable. You could relax and be ready to learn. That's exactly what young children need. They need to feel safe enough in a stable and secure enough environment to then be able to wonder and explore and work together.
Another thing that Fred did was ensure that the adult-child interactions we saw were characterized by deep listening and loving speech. This is a tool that's available at simpleinteractions.org, and it's also on page 85 of When You Wonder You're Learning. When we listen deeply and speak lovingly, we create that sense of psychological safety we know is so important. In fact, one of the most important things that Fred learned from his mentor, Margaret McFarland, was the Quaker philosophy that attitudes are caught, not taught. He knew how important it was to model psychological safety himself.
Think about a time when you modeled psychological safety. How did you express doubt and vulnerability in front of your students? How did you do that in front of your coworkers? Take some time now and discuss amongst yourselves the things that stand out when you think about modeling psychological safety.
So if you watch basically any episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you'll find him showing viewers that he too feels safe enough to ask questions, to admit his mistakes, to show doubt and vulnerability, and to ask for help from others. He and his guests model all of the behaviors that lay the groundwork for working together. So what does it look like to do this in our classrooms? Well, there are signals in the world to which we can look. These are real things that real teachers and experts have shared with us, real ways in which the Fred method can help us create psychologically safe spaces of our own. Hedda Sharapin shared with us this great example of the Ask It basket. She had gone to a school to see a masterful, magical teacher do her thing, probably someone just like you. And she walks into this classroom and sees this enormous wicker basket and thinks to herself, well, that's taking up a lot of space. What's that thing doing here? But she goes to the back of the classroom because she wants to see what happens. And in fact, she sees what she had gone to see. This is a great teacher. The kids are engaged, they're active, they're asking all sorts of questions. Now, sometimes those questions are right on point, and the teacher is taking the moment to respond to that question in the moment. But more often than not, those questions are coming right out from outer space. But regardless, the teacher is taking a moment, including for those out-of-space questions, to acknowledge the child, to notice the question that's been asked, to physically write that question down, and then to walk over to the Ask It basket and put it inside. And then to say out loud, later together, we're going to wonder about the answer or answers to your questions. Now imagine the things that are happening in that moment. That girl knows that she belongs in that space, that she's safe. and that it's safe to wonder and ask no matter what she might be thinking. And maybe most importantly, she knows that she is a caring adult who later, together with her, is going to wonder about the answer or answers to her questions. You and I can do that. We can create Ask It baskets in our own classrooms, in our libraries, even in our own kitchens. You could take a Tupperware container, a food storage container, and create your own Ask It basket with some Post-it notes, a crayon, and the space so that kids know that it's safe to wonder and to ask. Here's an incredibly modern example of the Ask It basket. Here you see a young girl taking photos of fish in an aquarium. Now those photos are attached to audio messages that the young girl records herself. The teacher can send that photo and that audio message home to a parent, family, or caregiver. Now what happens in that moment? Well, it's something that happens later. Because later in the day, when that caring adult picks up that child, that adult doesn't say like, "Oh, what did you do today?" As if any 4 or 5 or 6-year-old, let alone a grown-up, is going to say, "Well, let me tell you, we did this and this and this." No, in that moment, the adult can say, "Hey, I saw you looking at the blue fish in the aquarium. Like, why was that interesting to you? What caught your mind at that moment?" It facilitates a conversation, and it facilitates a safe conversation that child knows that, again, it is safe to ask questions and that I have a caring adult, a relationship in my life that is going to help me wonder about the things in my life. You and I can do that almost every single day with devices like this that are ubiquitous in all of the places we go.
You yourself can do this with Sproutabout.
Maybe give a smartphone to a child at a moment, a developmentally appropriate moment, and just ask him to notice the things that are happening in that space. And then together with him, look at the photos that he's taken or the audio he's recorded and ask, why was that interesting to you? What did you notice? What did it make you wonder about? Create spaces with the devices and opportunities and questions that kids have in their own lives together with you, the person who loves them so much.
So we've talked about psychological safety. How might we model positive behaviors and equip kids to resolve the conflicts that we know are inevitably going to rise in any team situation? Let's start with a question, and we love this one. What do you love to do more than anything else in the world? When do you feel most alive? When do you feel most yourself? Take a moment to think about that. Does everybody have some idea? Whatever it is, we're going to pause here again so that you can take the next minute and talk about it with the people around you. Tell them for the next 60 seconds about the thing that gives you such a good feeling.
Welcome back. We wish we could hear your answers. It's always so much fun to hear what teachers love. I'll share mine. I'm going to take you back to the first days of the pandemic. None of us wants to go there. Remember the ridiculousness of those first 2 weeks, like, we're just going to sit it out and we're going to be good, everyone, right? During those first 2 weeks, I walked into my garage. My garage at that time was a mess. This was before all sorts of Amazon boxes had arrived. And I found in my garage, in the midst of all of that mess, my skateboard. I hadn't been on my skateboard probably in about 30, maybe even 35 years. But in that moment, I decided, you know what? Now's a good time to pull up my skateboard. Now, I live in Western Pennsylvania. I mention that because there are all sorts of hills and valleys across Western Pennsylvania, and I live on top of a ridge. I got out my skateboard. I didn't put on a helmet. I didn't put on elbow pads. I didn't put on knee pads. I got on my skateboard and I started going down my driveway, then onto the street, then down to the bottom of the cul-de-sac. And I'm pleased to tell you that I got to the bottom without having killed myself. It was a ridiculous thing that I had done. I should never have gotten on that skateboard. But you know what? When I got on that skateboard, not only did I feel incredible fear, but I also felt all sorts of joy. And I felt joy because as a teenager, for days on end and summer nights on end, I would be on that skateboard doing all sorts of tricks. It was something that I loved to do. Now, I got down to the bottom of the cul-de-sac, and what I hadn't noticed is that my two daughters and their friends were running behind me. They're probably like, what is it that Mr. Bear's doing? What is this wacky thing? I'm not even sure they had seen a skateboard before. Do you know that today there are 6 young women in my neighborhood who are skateboarding enthusiasts? Now, I'm not a social scientist, and I can't draw a line from A to B, but do you know that in that moment, unbeknownst to me, I was a teacher. And as Fred said, the best teacher in the world is the one who loves what he or she does and loves it right in front of you. I was that teacher in that moment. And it wasn't just Fred. The neighborhood also brought us countless creative adults, all of whom were the best teachers in the world because they loved what they loved and they loved it right in front of kids. Some were professionals, people like Wynton Marsalis, Yo-Yo Ma, or Julia Child. No matter who they were, Fred never focused on their awards or their achievements. Instead, he asked them how they came to love that thing. He asked them to explain how they overcame difficulties and conflicts. He asked them to be themselves, to be teachers who modeled the same positive behaviors that he knew his viewers would need.
So we know from research what a powerful effect that modeling can have. I'll give you a quick example from Susan Engel, who is a psychologist who knows probably more about this than anyone in the world. Susan Engel and a graduate assistant did an experiment called Dancing Raisins with a group of young learners. And basically what this experiment asked them to do was drop raisins into a liquid solution. But Susan Engel and her assistant did something interesting. With one group of students, they followed the directions to a T. They just put raisins in the solution. With the second group, they would say something like, hey, I wonder if we put a Skittle in there. Or what would happen if we dropped a crayon into the solution? Then the researchers left the room, and what they found was that the kids who'd seen Susan Engel do experiments, the kids who'd seen Susan Engel be curious and wonder, they kept experimenting even after she'd left the room. Whereas the kids who'd watched the researchers just follow the directions to a T, they tended to do nothing at all once the adult was gone. Fred also showed us, again and again, how conflicts can be resolved through language.
Just as Susan Engel modeled wonder, questioning, and curiosity, Fred Rogers modeled behaviors too. In particular, he modeled how conflicts can be resolved through language.
It's very dramatic, Fred said, when two people come together to work something out. It's easy to resort to violence and annihilate your opposition. But what's really exciting to me is to see people with differing views come together and finally respect each other. Every day in the neighborhood, Fred presented us with different situations in which a team would have to resolve something. Maybe a pipe burst, or maybe there was an argument in the neighborhood. And things didn't always resolve very easily in the neighborhood. In fact, if you remember, at the beginning of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, they were just discrete 30-minute episodes. But after a while, Fred decided, we don't want to show kids that everything can be resolved in 30 minutes. And so he actually switched to 5-day theme weeks to show kids that conflict resolution sometimes takes a long time. There was actually a researcher named Lynette Friedrich Kofer who in the 1970s wanted to know whether all this was having an effect. And so Kofer did an interesting experiment in early learning centers just like yours. She showed one group of kids nature documentaries, she showed a second group of kids violent cartoons, and she showed a third group of kids episodes from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. What she found was that kids who watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, kids who watched Fred present us with all these situations in which characters had to work together, those kids turned out to be more collaborative. Those kids turned out to be more patient, more cooperative with one another. Again, we know how much modeling matters. And this is why. In the neighborhood, wrote Kofer, feelings, beliefs, and opinions are listened to with respect. Often neighbors are puzzled or don't understand views that are different from their own. In some cases, this calls for reassurance. In others, it means a series of questions or challenges. But in every case, what's common to each situation is the careful progression and the clarification of ideas and feelings that includes all participants. And rather than shaming characters for their mistakes or their missteps or their arguments or their conflicts, Fred celebrated them as evidence of learning.
So, what does it look like to model these behaviors for young people? Let's take a minute to reflect on that. What behaviors do you model to children that can help them overcome difficulties and handle conflicts?
We want to share two real-life examples. First, you're probably familiar with Friday Night Lights. Football games all across this country on Friday and Saturday nights, communities coming together. Well, here's a twist on Friday Night Lights. Here in the slide, you see two teachers, Jen and Tracy, teachers of young kids. And you know what it is that they love to do? They love to read books. And they wondered, how could I bring that love of books to the whole community? And they'd noticed the joy of Friday Night Lights, and they thought, what if we combined Friday Night Lights with our love of reading and created literacy under the lights? And in fact, as we do so, bring together the whole community to celebrate reading. And they did. You see the barber reading books about barbering. You see a music teacher reading books about music education. The whole community came together to demonstrate the joy and love of reading. And they were modeling a behavior of working together for the kids and families right in front of them. Here's another example of adults coming together to model these behaviors for kids. In a primary school with kindergarten teachers, first grade teachers, second grade teachers. Imagine these teachers working together to teach young children interview protocols, and then having those kids go throughout the school building to interview teachers, but also the bus drivers, the office secretary, whomever it is that's in that school that's a big adult. And for the kids to ask those adults, what's a life lesson? What's something that you've learned? It's a very Fred Rogers sensibility, because Fred taught us that everyone has something worth giving. Well, the kids noticed those lessons, they reflected on those lessons, and then they created artwork that was hung at the height of a child, along with the words and messages that the adults had conveyed to the young kids and that the kids heard about how they resolved challenges in their lives, how they resolved problems, how they came together to do good for themselves and the people they care about.
So we've talked now about modeling team behaviors and conflict resolution strategies. How might we put them into action and harness the power of we? Let me ask you this. What's the most memorable way someone has ever shown you how much they care about you? Take a moment to think about that. I'll tell you my story. When I was in 3rd grade, I had a classmate come to me and he told me, "Hey, I saw your dad in the library the other day." And let me tell you, my dad is a wonderful person, many great things, but he's not much of a reader. And so when my classmate told me he saw my dad in the library, I was a little bit skeptical. But it turns out he was right. My dad was in the library. He was checking out every book he could find about the game of soccer. And he was at the library for weeks on end studying the game because he knew I wanted to play and he wanted to coach my team. There are so many ways we can show the people in our lives that we care about them. Take just a moment to think about the time someone showed up for you when you needed them most. Welcome back. You know, there's a wonderful poem by the writer Raymond Carver called Late Fragment. It's a very famous poem. Some of you might know this one. And did you get what you wanted from this life? Even so, I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. At the end of the day, what's the one thing that matters more than anything else? To call ourselves beloved, to feel ourselves beloved on the earth. And however it was that someone showed you that they care about you, it likely had the same effect, to make you feel cared for, to make you feel beloved on the earth. And whether we knew it or not, Fred himself showed us how we can do the same for the people in our lives.
That's right. In fact, in the early 1970s, Hallmark, the greeting card company, invited celebrities to design holiday displays for their flagship Manhattan store. One display was noticeably different from the others. It was a single pine tree, about the height of a child, encased in clear acrylic. It had no lights, no tinsel, no ornaments, nothing fancy. It didn't even say who designed it. There was only a plaque that said this. Now, of course, we know who the designer was. If there was one message at the core of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it was this: I like you just the way you are. And although we don't always think about feeling accepted as a basic human need, those feelings matter as much as food and water. There are all sorts of interesting studies about this, and I'll briefly share just one. In 2002, a group of researchers gave some college students a fake personality test and assigned them to groups based on their supposed results. They told one group that they'd have rewarding, caring relationships throughout their lives. They told another group that their friendships would fade, their marriages would end, and they'd likely spend most of their lives alone. And they told another group that they'd be prone to physical accidents such as car crashes. Then the researchers gave each group an IQ test. And the only group that bombed it was the group who'd been told that they'd been rejected. Even that car crash group didn't seem all that affected. So the researchers concluded that it wasn't bad news in general that had caused a drop in test scores, but rather the prospect of social exclusion. When confronted with this horrific idea of spending their lives alone, students lost the ability to think, to reason clearly, to learn. In fact, we know from modern brain science that feeling rejected or ostracized or excluded hurts just like physical pain. Now, fortunately, the researchers apologized afterward and assured the groups that it had all been a ruse, but it underscores the importance of Fred's message of radical acceptance. Fred knew that we all need the same thing, which is this: whether we're a preschooler or a young teen, a graduating college senior or a retired person, we human beings all want to know that we're acceptable and that our being alive somehow makes a difference in the lives of others. We need to know that we're worth being proud of. Kids and adults have to know that they matter to the people around them, that they're worth being proud of just the way they are. Now, this doesn't mean that we tell them that they're perfect or everything that they think or do is great or even okay. But what it does mean is that we refuse to reject their humanity. We refuse to make them feel less than. We refuse to make them feel that their joys or their flaws or their full complicated selves make them unworthy of the neighborhood.
So what does this look like? Take 2 minutes. 1 minute to answer this question, and 1 minute to listen to your neighbor's answer. How do you show your coworkers, your students, and their families how much they matter?
seen a red carpet before. We see it when we watch award shows. We maybe see it when there's a fancy event in our town. Imagine this. Imagine placing a red carpet right at the entrance to your early learning classroom or to your early learning school. What does that signal? What signals for that child and the caring adult in his or her life? The same thing that it signals when you watch the Oscars. It signals you're special. It matters that you're here. We're so excited that you're here. You belong here. With a simple little red carpet, we can convey physically that same sensibility that you matter, that I like you just the way you are, that you belong here, and that I am so glad that you've come here today. And more than anything else, the thing that we grown-ups can do in kids' lives is simply to be there, to be present by the side of any single child at any single moment, no matter what feeling they're feeling. The most important thing that we can do, the gift that we can give, is to be there.
What all this adds up to is an atmosphere. A reporter once asked Fred Rogers, "What is the neighborhood? How would you describe it?" And when Fred answered, he didn't call it a television program. Instead, he called it an atmosphere that allows people to be comfortable enough to be who they really are. All of us have a role to play in creating that atmosphere. That's why Fred left us his blueprints. The truth of Fred's ministry, wrote his wife Joanne, was that every last one of us can be as caring, kind, and influential in children's lives as he was. Every last one of us can do a version of what Fred did. You all are proof of that. Each and every one of us can give what Fred called the greatest gift. The greatest thing we can do, he said, is let people know that they are loved and capable of loving. So with that, we're going to close by doing an exercise that Fred himself used to do to remind us that we are loved and capable of loving ourselves. And we think this exercise sums up everything Fred did, everything Mr. Rogers' neighborhood was about. And so I'm just going to recite it to you, word for word. From the time you were very little, you've had people who have smiled you into smiling, people who've talked you into talking, sung you into singing, loved you into loving. Some of them may be here right now. Some may be far away. Some may even be in heaven. But wherever they are, if they've loved you and encouraged you and wanted what was best in life for you, they're right inside yourself. And we feel that you deserve some quiet time on this special occasion to devote some thought to them. So, let's just take a minute in honor of those who've cared about us all along the way. One silent minute.
Around the turn of the millennium, Fred issued us all a challenge. Try your best to make goodness attractive, he said. That's one of the toughest assignments you'll ever be given. And Fred was right. It's tough. It is easier to tear down than it is to build. It is easier to criticize than it is to create. It is easier to fear thy neighbor than it is to love them. But if we want every child to have the freedom to discover her potential, if we want to raise creative, curious, caring kids, if we want to build stronger, more inclusive communities and a more just and loving world, then making goodness attractive is what we have to do. and whomever it was that you were thinking about during your one silent minute. Whether it was a parent, a teacher, a friend, maybe even Fred Rogers himself. He or she is living proof that making goodness attractive is possible. How are we going to do the same thing for our kids? That's our charge. That's why each of you is here right now.
How might we take Fred forward? Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.